Well, hello and welcome to video number 4. We're going to have a look in this video at what I'm going to call the adopted child, the creation of Israel, and what would take place the day after Israel was created, at the start of the first Arab-Israeli war. So that's where we're headed today. Let's jump right in. Where we left off in the last video, the UN had made a plan for partitioning Palestine into an Arab state, a Jewish state, and an internationalized Jerusalem. And the British had tried to wash their hands of the whole mess, and they had said, we're going to be leaving, all of the British troops are going to be out, and then these guys, they are on their own to work themselves out. And so on the 14th of May 1948, as the last British troops are leaving the port city of Haifa, David Ben-Gurion, a guy whose name we're going to come across a few times over the next few lessons, he was speaking at a museum in Tel Aviv, proclaiming the state of Israel. And instantly, as soon as this declaration is made, the US and the Soviet Union both went, yep, we acknowledge that this country has come into existence. And so a government is formed. Ben-Gurion becomes the Prime Minister and also the Minister of Defense. And democratic elections are held in January 1949. What we're going to be doing in class is having a look at the language used in the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel. So we'll have a look at that in class. But once that declaration is made, instantly, the following day, on the 15th of May, there is an Arab army that crosses the frontiers of Palestine with the intention of establishing one Palestinian state. That's their goal. No Jewish, no Arab state, no sharing, no partitioning, that the whole place would be one Palestinian state. And so this army included 1,000 Lebanese soldiers, 5,000 Syrians, 5,000 Iraqis, 10,000 Egyptians, with a few Saudi Arabian, Libyan, and Yemeni volunteers. Keep in mind that in terms of Palestinian fighters, there weren't that many, and so they, in some ways, were a little bit fearful that that if this mob were successful, that rather than creating a unified Palestinian state, maybe they would be keen to take some land for themselves, particularly the Egyptians and the Syrians. So why did they do this? Remember, firstly, they had voted no at the UN General Assembly when the vote had gone to the UN to say, are we going to partition Palestine? These guys had voted no. They were hoping to prevent the ruin of the Palestinians. They felt that should the Jews have their own state, that they were really going to overrun the Arabs, that they had gotten the raw end of the deal, that they hadn't really been listened to. They also didn't want Palestinian Arabs flooding into their own countries. The Lebanese, the Egyptians, the Iraqis, the Syrians, they didn't want these Palestinians to come into their borders. And so, with that, the first Arab-Israeli war had begun. The Israelis, the US, the USSR, they all saw the entry of these Arab states into Palestine as a legal aggression. And so, a few days later, on the 26th of May, the Israel Defense Forces, or the IDF, was officially established. Now, the IDF, we've come across the groups, the Haganah and the Irgun. There was another group called the Palmach as well. They were all absorbed into the Israeli army. They all became one. And so, as the war progressed, there were more soldiers coming into the IDF than the Arabs were able to gain on their side. And so, by July, a couple months later, the IDF had 63,000 troops, and that had grown into 1949 up to 115,000 troops. At the same time as the IDF having 63,000, there were only 40,000 Arab soldiers, and that only rose to 55,000 and only rose a little bit further by the early spring of 1949. So we're really looking at the Israelis having about double the troops that the Arabs did. If it's purely a numbers game, the Israelis are going to beat the Arabs 2-1. They're going to win quite easily. And so what we need to see from this is that this war, from the Israeli side, is the war of independence, because for them, they were ensuring that assuming that they won, they were ensuring that they had created their own state by themselves. They've been able to defend the land that they had said was going to be theirs, that had been given to them by the UN, and they had effectively made sure that they had secured independence. For the Palestinians, though, they refer to this war as al-Nakba, or the catastrophe. The Palestinian Arabs really could never see Zionism as a particularly just cause. They regarded the Israelis as foreign intruders who had invaded their land. They didn't see that they should be held responsible for what had happened to the European Jews during the Holocaust, and yet they were now the ones who were paying the price, not the Nazis, not people in Europe, but they were the ones counting the cost of something that had happened that they weren't remotely responsible for. On the flip side, though, if you're a Zionist, if you are a Jew looking to establish your own state, they couldn't have accepted anything less than a Jewish state in Palestine. And there were some people who believed that there was enough room to live together, to live in peace, but ultimately there really weren't enough of those people to be able to make something happen. And so the question becomes, well, was this an inevitable war? And to be honest, both sides saw this war as inevitable. They both felt like this is where things were headed. And whether there was going to be a Jewish state or not, it was always going to be decided by military force. It's not usual for people to just volunteer to give their land up to an incoming population. And so we have to remember that the Palestinian Arabs had been there well before the Jews looked at that land and went, hey, we think that should be the place where we have our national home, and that doing that would force them out. We do need to accept, though, that both sides have to take responsibility for the way that this played out. Because if the Arabs had won this war, newsflash and spoilers, they didn't win this one, but had the Arabs won, they probably would not have been as concerned with the fate of the Zionists, just like the Israelis really couldn't have given a rat's about what happened to the Palestinians when they did end up winning. And so, if we look at how this war ended, it ended in the early months of 1949. There were a series of armistices that Israel signed with each of the different Arab states which had invaded. So, an armistice with Egypt, with Lebanon, with Transjordan, and with Syria. And so, of course, we have Egypt down in this area, Lebanon up here, Transjordan over this side, and Syria over to the east. And so the ceasefires that they created were known as the Green Line. You can see that on the map here. This Green Line where they basically agreed that inside of that Green Line, with its plain greys, that would be Palestine there, or the Arab Palestine. And so these new borders of Israel basically encompassed about 78% of this whole region of land. Over 3/4 of the land, the Jews were saying, this is ours now. And that was about 25% more than what the UN had initially allotted to them. And so Transjordan was occupied, they annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip. Sorry, my apologies. Transjordan was going to control this section on the Palestinian Arabs' behalf, and the Gaza Strip, this little section here, was retained, and this was going to be ruled by Egypt. And so these two areas, ruled by Egypt and ruled by Transjordan, neither of them an independent Palestinian state. And so even at the end of this war, the Palestinians, who 3 decades ago, having been promised a state by the British, even now, with the creation of a Jewish state, they don't have their own individual Palestinian state. And that's something that's really important, because even today, we still don't have that. And so we looked at these maps in the last video, but I think it's worthwhile us having a look at that. Again, you can see the difference in the land that the Jews took. So this area here is a whole lot smaller on this map on the right. In the same way, this section of the West Bank is significantly smaller, and this area around Nazareth and Acre is also not there for the Arabs at all either. And so in terms of casualties, when we look at what happened in this war, it wasn't a hugely bloody war. Israeli casualties amounted to about 6,000 killed, 4,000 of those were soldiers and 2,000 were civilians, and Arab losses were somewhere between 10 and 15,000 who were killed. Keeping in mind that they really only had about 60,000 soldiers to begin with, so almost 1/3 of their force. The biggest question, though, at the end of this war was, okay, the 750,000 Palestinian Arabs who have now fled because of the conflict or have been expelled, what is going to happen to them? And Israel's first president, a guy called Chaim Weizmann, he called the Exodus, this movement of Palestinian refugees out, he called it a miraculous clearing of the land. It doesn't really sound like he was particularly concerned with what was going to happen to these Palestinian Arabs. They were just keen to be able to use the land that they had just secured for themselves. And so Arab leaders, they didn't say, okay, all of the Palestinian Arabs, you've got to leave your homes. But it is unclear also whether the Israeli leaders actually wanted a systematic removal of the Arab population, whether they tried to force the Arabs out. You need to think of it as the Nazis having cleared out the Jews in Europe. Were they now doing the same thing to the Palestinian Arabs? That's the question. It's certainly the case that Ben Gurion, the first Prime Minister, he didn't want very many Arabs left within the Jewish area, and so his desire was for there to be as few as possible. And many of the Palestinian leaders had either been exiled or they'd fled prior to 1948, prior to Israel becoming established, and so this left the townspeople and the villagers relatively helpless, with nowhere to go and no leadership either. So if we just have a look at the way that this war was fought and compare the Arab and Israeli forces, two images here. One shows the Arab forces, the Palestinian Arabs. The other shows the Israelis. Which one of these two looks like they have been better supported and better supplied, particularly by international powers? I'll give you a clue. The Israeli side was far more supported than the Palestinian Arabs. Wonder if you can work out, based on those two pictures, which group was which. And the question then needs to be, well, what does this suggest about the way that these two groups were supported by international powers? And so we've got some issues that are still lingering about this war, because the outcome is still determining most of the direction of the contemporary Arab-Israeli conflict. Most of what is still being argued about, even today, has its roots in this particular war. And so Palestinian Arabs are still stateless. They still have no country to call their own, and tens of thousands of them are surviving in refugee camps. They're homeless right across the Middle East. And so Palestinians are prohibited. They can't return to their homes. They're not going to receive compensation from the Israelis. And so the future of these occupied territories, where the Jews have relative control, the status of Jerusalem, who has control over that, how is that managed, the sharing of water resources, and a whole range of other issues are still not agreed on. When you think about it, the war of 1948-1949 was not a particularly large-scale war. Most of the weapons used were mainly World War II vintage rifles, light medium machine guns, a few tanks, not many aircraft, and no atom bombs or anything like that used. But the repercussions of this war were enormous, because with Israel possessing 50% more territory than was allocated to them by the UN, with no real peace treaty signed, they signed armistices, they agreed, okay, we're going to stop fighting, but no real peace treaties, and no Palestinian Arab state established. They gave them no independent voice in any sort of negotiations moving forward, and so the Israelis really have the upper hand at the end of this war. And so there's a new pattern that emerges. The Jews and the Arabs, in addition to trying to mobilize their own resources to get there, and they call upon their friends and their allies outside of Palestine for help. And the thing to note here is that the Israelis have been more successful in gaining material and moral support for their cause. This is mostly because of the Zionist movement, which in the US and Britain appealed to Christians who felt like if they supported the Jews, who were God's chosen people, they felt like that was what God had wanted them to do. Some of the Christian vision, the way that Christians view the world, is actually quite anti-Semitic. We've got to keep in mind that Christians believe that there will be a day of judgment where Jews either have to accept Christ as their Messiah or remain Jews and potentially be damned in hell for eternity. And so, to fundamentalist Christians, the establishment of a Jewish state is actually something that needs to happen. If you read closely in the Bible, and people read into it that, okay, if there is a Jewish state in Israel, that has to happen before Jesus Christ can return back to earth. The second coming of Christ and then the day of judgment, which is all referred to in the Bible. Certainly safe to say that Zionists drew on a sense of guilt that was felt by Western nations, because when the Western nations didn't do anything to save the Jews through the Holocaust, they didn't rescue them from Nazi extermination, many of them at least. Certainly that massive sense of guilt of we didn't do enough, and so because we didn't do enough then, now we need to do something for the Jews. And the reluctance of Christian commentators to criticize what Israel had been doing. Israel is certainly not innocent in any of what has gone on at this particular time, but the Holocaust really becomes the center of the moral compass at this time. And you've got the memory of the Holocaust, which creates this anxiety and a determination also to make sure that this doesn't happen to the Jews ever again. And so it's really difficult for Israelis and their supporters to see that maybe there is another group of people who's been really hard done by, that being the Palestinian Arabs. And the Palestinian Arabs, they were less successful in gaining support from the West, and most of the assistance that they got was given begrudgingly and inadequately. You could see with the number of troops that were fighting on their behalf, less than what the Israelis had. And why did the US and European powers not intervene as much or not support them? Well, simply they were too busy reconstructing Europe, securing oil, protecting their oil interests in the Arabian Peninsula, and for America at least, to try and contain the Soviet Union, to limit their influence. They were too busy worrying about all those things to worry about whether Palestine had, or the Palestinian Arabs had their own individual state. And so here we have a situation where Israel has fought this war against the Arabs. The Israelis have won. They have taken far more land than had been initially promised or allocated to them. They have a state. They have the support of the majority of the Western world, and the Palestinian Arabs are pretty well left high and dry. That's where we're going to leave it in this video, but we'll make sure that we explore what happens next in the next one.